Hello ladies and gentlemen, I am BorderWise and welcome to the From the Depths APS shell component rundown. I nearly said hoedown, that is a different thing. And so, there is a story behind this video, and you might have noticed that this video is hopefully shorter than what I usually do, particularly the last one. This was meant to be part of a much longer video just covering APS shells and what works and what gauge, and all that kind of stuff, and going into lots of detail and practical demonstrations. The problem with that is that I am sick. I am not as sick as I was, but I'm still pretty sick. You might hear it in my voice. I am very mucusy, and just I'm croaky and sniffly and just phlegmy and horrible, and my voice might not survive an hour-long video, so we're going to break it up a little bit. I'm going to start just by running through all the APS shell components that are available in the ammo controller. And we'll start with there, and I plan to do a little practical demonstration of how to, design a shell from scratch. So, for start off with, there are a lot of shell components. There's about 36 in total, and I've conveniently laid them out here in their respective categories. There are also way too many shell type combinations to cover in just one video, so I probably am just going to stick to the ones in videos to come that are the most effective or interesting or fun. But let's get started over here. So, to start off with, we have casings, and this is what goes on the back of the shell and helps shove it forward when you fire it out of your gun. So there's two of them. Firstly, there's a gunpowder casing, so that's standard propellant. Casings only count as half a normal part for ammo cost and reload calculation. So, casings you can get away with having a lot of. Yeah, you can hear that I'm having to swallow, phlegm with every breath. But in any case, so, you can have a lot of casings. And so, if we go here, ammo cost 3.3, reload time, that shoots up a little bit if that's not a casing, so casings are good for that. You can have lots of them. And gunpowder casings, as far as I know, are the only thing that affect how quickly a gun cools, because this is, well, it's a hot thing. It's an explosion in a barrel, heats up the barrel, and you need to let it cool down a bit, or actively cool it. The contrast to that, let's turn the UI back on, is railgun casings. Now, railguns are super good at the moment, as of the time of recording, because I know they're just very convenient. These do not need coolers at all, and the railgun casing itself increases the max rail energy that can be used to fire the shell. Casings only count as half a normal part for ammo cost and reload calculations, just like the other thing. So if we go here, and if we chuck another warhead on here, you'll see maximum rail draw for the 60mm shell is 330. Is it going to do that thing? Yes, it is. I don't know why that is, but at a certain gauge, this actually... Wait, no. I wasn't paying attention. Okay. Okay. That does give more rail draw than gunpowder casings, but it gives less than just another warhead. So, if you're using a railgun, you use these railgun casings instead of gunpowder casings if you want to just jam more rail draw into the thing. Because as you can see here, rail draw is 330, if you type in 330, and if we increase it any more than that, it does nothing. It does absolutely nothing at all. So let's go back here, 300, 330, and particularly watch the kinetic damage and muzzle velocity. Okay, it did do something. Great. And then it didn't do anything. So, well, that's because it's 0.1 right there. So, railgun casings, good idea to have them in railguns, but only if you need them, because if you're making a pure railgun, you can not bother with casings at all, and it's absolutely fine. So, that's all well and good. Now we move on to, those are the two kinds of casings. There's only two in this section. Now we move on to what you can stick on the rear of the shell. So the rear of the shell, casings always go at the back. You cannot put them at the front, which is pretty obvious. And At the rear, these are things that only go between casings and middle shell parts. So to start off with, in order, we have the Graviton Ram, which in past versions of the game was one of the cheesiest things in the world. It's been toned down a little bit. So what this is that a shell developed by the Lightning Hoods for use by the White Flares. There's a bit of lore and fluff for you. Let's turn this down. The shell part compounds the physical mass of the entire shell into a massive gravimetric shockwave exerting huge forces on the target. Now, what that means is that the recoil force, which is here, by the way, so let's add some rail power back. So, it's got recoil force of 440, which is exactly the same number as the maximum rail draw. Actually, let's just go back to 440. 440, so what that means is that if the shell hits something, it will exert this amount of force on it, and just essentially it's shoving it. It's converting kinetic damage into motion. Now, back in the day, there used to be a slider over here that allowed you to determine whether the push just moves it along, as it moves the target along, it just pushes it, or turns it. So it's torque versus push, and that was broken because it meant that you could just use a gun, put a lot of kinetic damage on it, and put a Graviton Ram at one end, max up the torque, and you could just essentially spin enemy vehicles and like capsize them really easily. But that's gone now. You can only push them around, which is pretty sweet. Still useful, by the way. Like, if you get your timing right, a small craft can quite easily be capsized with this, particularly if you use this with railguns. So I'm going to mention railguns quite a bit during this little shell component overview, and that's because railguns are awesome. So, moving right along, now we get the base bleeder. Now, the base bleeder is one of my favorite shell components simply because I use it all the time. So, the base bleeder releases gas from the base of the shell to fill the low pressure area behind the shell. It increases the shell's speed modified by 10%, but also destabilizes it so inaccuracy is increased by 25%. So, I actually didn't know that before reading it. I didn't realize it increased inaccuracy. But these things are great because they work with both railgun casings and gunpowder casings, or they just work with shell motion full stop, I find. Like, if you make a railgun and you just stick a base bleeder on the end of it, the shell will go faster. It's very convenient. So, it's most effective when you're using a large amount of gunpowder casings or a lot of rail draw. So, yeah, so let's just demonstrate this right now. So, maximum rail draw is 440, so let's go, say, 300 and 925 meters per second already. This is a very fast shell. And if we replace that with this, you'll notice it drops considerably. So, we could replace it with a gunpowder casing as well. 919, still with 300 rail draw. Do that. 300 rail draw again. You put a base bleeder on this, it works with that rail draw, and it's actually faster. So, again, with railguns, if you're only going to stick one gunpowder casing on it, you might as well make it a base bleeder. It's very slightly faster. So, base bleeders are awesome. I use them pretty much all the time. It's really good. And next we have the Supercavitation Base, and I, in videos gone by, keep mispronouncing this. I call it a Supercavitation Base, which is not correct. I forget what supercavitation actually means. It's something to do with how water works. But what this does is that it removes 90% of the slowdown incurred by water. It also removes entirely the chance of a projectile skimming or bouncing off water. They lower warhead payloads to 75% of standard, so explosive, frag, and EMP. This is, again, it's a very useful shell component. I keep forgetting to use it because, personally, I don't use APS to shoot at things that are below the waterline. But there are certain campaign designs, most notably the paddle gunner and the trebuchet, the T-board guard, a frontsider, and an Onyx watch frontsider. Both godly designs, which use supercavitation bases, and they are really damn scary because they're one of the few things that, well, the trebuchet isn't particularly good at it, but the paddle gunner can easily kill submarines. This kind of shell, as in shells with the Supercavitation Base, along with torpedoes and particle cannons, are one of the few ways you can reliably shoot at submarines, and they're also one of the few things you can successfully use on submarines. Just a submarine's armament is pretty much limited to advanced cannons used with supercavitation bases, missiles, torpedoes, and particle cannons. And possibly also mines. And I have heard that people have managed to use cram shells on submarines. I have not tried that. I reckon that would take a bit of time to get working. And I also... what is something? Oh yeah, ram subs are also pretty well. So it's just, well, a submarine covered in rams that just runs into things. But yeah, supercavitation bases, very good. They do lower your payload a little bit, so it's best used on shells. Like, I'll give you an example. So, we've got 106 explosive damage right here. That's with the supercavitation base. Base bleeder, that's now 142. So, bear in mind that your shells will do less damage. They will be way more effective against anything below the water, but you're not getting as much bang for your buck with anything above the water. So, that's fair and reasonable. And lastly, we have the Visible Tracer, and this thing is not very useful anymore. It used to be very useful indeed. In fact, back before the big APS update, Visible Tracers were very useful because they increase the accuracy of shots fired after it as long as the subsequent shots are fairly quickly fired and of the same or similar muzzle velocity. Tracers make the shell more detectable for enemy countermeasures. So, what that means is that the more shells you fire, the more accurate each following shell is, which is great because APS could, and still can in some cases, fire very, very quickly, and it meant you didn't need a very long barrel to make your shells accurate because the tracers would just do the trick. APS is a lot more accurate now, so this is less useful and less necessary, and you don't need super long barrels either for good accuracy. And making it more detectable for enemy countermeasures just gives, especially on big shells, well, pretty much only on big shells, it gives lambs more chance to detect your shell and destroy it. Not that that's easy right now, but it is a bit of a downside. So visible tracers, I generally don't use them. I tend to use base bleeders instead, because I find that extra accuracy is nice, but faster shell speed is very, very nice. So, I would take a base bleeder over a visible tracer 90% of the time, although tracers do look really cool. Like, you can have them in different colors, and I remember Lathrix, if you don't know him, he made a lot of From the Depths content for a long time. It was very, very good. He made a Christmas-themed mech one time. I don't remember which video it is. If I can, I will link it in the description because it's hilarious. And he set it up so that it fired a rainbow of of shells. So lots of different shells, each one with a different tracer on it, and it was really hilarious and cool and fun. So that is visible tracers are fun, I will say that. Not as useful as they once were, but they're very fun. I'm gonna sneeze. Oh no. Nope, I refuse. I refuse. Okay, now I'm good now. Alright, so that's the rear of the thing. So 2 casing components. 4. Was it just 4? Yeah, it was just 4. I thought it was 5 for some reason. And yeah, moving on to the body, or the middle components. And there's lots of these. In particular because this is the area of the shell where you stick fuses. And fuses are like the lifeblood of your shell all the time. So to start off with, we've got Frag. And anything in the middle, by the way, you can stick that anywhere on a shell. It can be at the back, it can be at the front, it can be in the middle, doesn't matter. You will... it also depends on what you're doing, by the way, because this shell has, even if you stick some railgun draw on this particular shell, it'll have pretty lousy accuracy, and also not as fast as you could make it. You'll be better off using the head version. See there, muzzle velocity 645. That jumps to over 800 with this rail draw, so better off doing that if you want just a single component shell. But anyway, so, off topic. So, Frag! Frag has had a long and controversial, annoying history in From the Depths, if you weren't aware of that before, because it used to be just so good. It still is good, by the way, but it's not automatically better than a whole lot of other things. So, what this is that, well, it says it right there. It creates a cloud of shrapnel on detonation. So there's 2 factors to frag. Well, no, there's 3 factors to frag. 4, actually, now that I'm counting and remembering. There's the number of fragments. So in this particular shell, it's 5, which is not many. There's the fragment damage, which is the damage per one of these little frags, which in this case is 141. That's not much. And fragment cone angle, and the default is 60, so... In 180, we'll explode fragments into a complete sphere. So it's what you use when you want to say good anti-air, for instance. Or you just want the thing to guarantee a hit, no matter how small, on the target. And the other thing is the elevation offset, and I completely forgot about this because I never use it. So there is footage online of... I'm not going to link this in the description, by the way. There are certain weapons in real life in which when the shell explodes, not only does it spray fragments everywhere, it sprays it at a certain angle, so up or down, or like sideways, in funky patterns and all that. And this is what this is. So you can have it so that when the shell is fired, it sprays all its fragments straight down. I've never used this, so I don't know how useful this is, but I am led to believe that if you rig this up right, and do cunning things with other shell components, you can have a shell that basically repeatedly just sprays the deck of a ship with fragments. Or you could go the other way, and you can have something that is fired, well, combined with a Supercavitation Base. You can fire it off a submarine, and just you can consistently spray fragments upwards at the underside of an enemy craft. So, that's kind of cool. So, but yeah, fragments are not as ridiculously OP as they used to be, but they are still pretty good if you want to just get little projectiles and shred things with them. And I've done a fair amount of testing with them. They can work, and the best angle, by the way, is 180 degrees, because the higher the cone angle, the more damage per fragment, and that is purely for balance. By the way, if you turn it the other way, this does almost no damage, so it would go this way. At a 1 degree angle, it's only 48 damage per fragment. That's nothing. So, getting that back to 60, 141, get up to 90, 165, and get it up to 180, it's over 200, 219. That is significantly better than 48. And yes, a lot of the fragments are going the wrong way, but it more than makes up for the fact, like, 219, what is 48 times 5? 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 50 times 5 is about 250 in total for all the fragments. You go here, that is, like, only a little bit higher than this, and you still got fragments going in roughly the same direction with this. So this, I have found, consistently outperforms anything over here. So, that's fragments for you. And then next on the list is the solid Warhead Body. And what this does, adds a large amount of mass for kinetic damage and allows for faster flight. So, to contrast with this, let's go back to our Frag Warhead Body, and we've still got 300 rail draw, 710 meters per second, whoop, 645, and 710. So, one of the ways that this warhead is useful is, it's just like if you don't want to mess around with casings or base bleeders or even tweak the amount of gunpowder that is in it. I forgot to mention as well, this is important, you can tweak how much propellant is in here. So say I want this shell to be a little bit slower, and yes, when you've got multiple guns in a turret, sometimes that is useful, just for the local weapon controller. And you can adjust this to be less. You can take it all the way down to there, 0.01 propellant density, and you can take it up to any any density you like, so that's very handy. If you don't want to do that, just adding or removing solid warheads actually helps a lot, because the solid warhead bodies allow your shell to fly faster. It's quite helpful. They also add a lot of kinetic damage, so let's turn this into a Frag Warhead Body again, and 300 rail draw, Actually, let's make that 200 rail draw because that's sensible. 615. So kinetic damage right now is pretty garbage, ignoring the damage the fragments do. And the armor piercing is 2.2, which is pretty bad. So if we go to solid warhead, keep an eye on that number. Okay, so the kinetic damage hasn't gone up at all, but the armor pierce has gone up a lot, a huge amount. And these things also, it doesn't say that as of right now in the tooltip, but these things improve armor piercing as well as kinetic damage. Excuse me. So yeah, if you want a kinetic shell, you're probably going to be using a fair amount of these, or using them a lot anyway. Moving on, now we have the solid warhead body's skinnier, faster brother, which is the Sabot warhead body. I keep mispronouncing that apparently. It's not Sabot, Sabot, Sabo. Is it Sabo or Sabot? Just let me know in the comments what that is. It is Le French, that I know, but it is not the right gut. It's, I don't know. I can't pronounce things. So the Sabot warhead body is kind of the opposite. This, let's go back to here. So watch the armor pierce. 23 with 200, essentially propellant, because railguns charge and gunpowder casings are pretty directly equivalent for how much force they exert. So, solid warhead body, 23.7 armor piercing for this rather rubbish little shell we got here. That jumps to 33 with the Sabot warhead body, and the kinetic damage drops. So this is more KD, less AP, and this is more AP, less KD. So Sabot warhead bodies are also a lot faster, although it doesn't really show that right here, so yeah. Increases AP but has reduced mass presence of this warhead, sets explosive damage to 25%. So the hilarious thing about that is that this works on explosives, EMP, and Flack, so that reduces the damage of it. So let me just demonstrate that right now by doing this. I can't do that. Let's do this. Okay, so solid, and we're going to stick an HE warhead right there. Explosive damage 142. We stick a Sabot warhead on here right now. Whoopsie daisy, it's now at 35. And let's go back to solid and stick was it Flak warhead, 59 flak damage, and Sabot warhead, whoopsie, 15. And back to solid, and EMP is at 33, and Sabot warhead is, whoops, 8. And now back to solid, and Frag. So, 1 for 1 and 5. 5 and 1 for 1, and we go to Sabot warhead. Oh, hello. That didn't change at all. I have no idea if that is intentional with the update that just happened, but you can use Sabot warheads and Frag warheads, and also Sabot heads and Frag heads. Well, not both of the heads at the same time, that would be weird. But you can use Sabot warheads and Frag warheads together, and they do not penalize each other. You do get considerably reduced armor piercing if you stick Frag warhead bodies on this, but you can use these. These synergize. Again, don't get too used to that, because by the time you watch this video, they might have patched that out, because I don't know if this is on purpose. It might not be. So, yeah. That's fun like that. Let's go back to here, and one Sabot. So, you want to use Sabot warheads when you really want to increase the armor piercing of a shell, and you don't actually want to change whatever its nose is. So, that's handy, and yeah, so kinetic damage, more AP, less KD. And now we're moving on, and this is where, by the way, you can roughly divide the damage dealing of a shell into kinetic damage and chemical damage. So, chemical shells are high explosive, flak, EMP, and not so much frag. Frag is kinetic. And yeah, those are the three. It is high explosive, flak, and EMP. And this is the HE Warhead Body, and this is the workhorse of APS, particularly at higher gauges. It's as this says, it creates an explosion. What more do you want? And this is very, very strong, particularly if you stack it up to 3, 4, maybe 5 times on a single warhead, or on a single shell rather, or if you up the gauge of the shell. So this is 60mm we're looking at right now. explosive damage is 142. If you up that a little bit to 100, that's up to about 296, about 300 explosive damage. Okay, that's more than doubled already. We stick it up to 400. Oh, hello, that's 2,000 explosive damage, and this is just one component. And the stacking for these things works every extra high explosive warhead body you stick on a shell. It's only 80% of the last one, so this is about 2,000. Let's try and get that down to 2,000, because that's convenient. So, about 378, so this is 2005. The next shell you add, the next HE component you add will not be 2005, it won't add that much, it'll add a little bit less, and then the third one, a little bit less, even more, and so on and so forth. So, you can stack them a lot more than you used to, back before the big update, but there is diminishing returns eventually, so you can't have a shell in which there's like 20 stacked HE warheads. Well, you can, it just won't be very efficient, because you will get diminishing returns eventually. So, but yeah, at 500mm, 3,000 damage. That is, it's not huge, but this is on an APS shell, so it's you can get pretty high numbers with this, and very good velocity. So it is high explosive delivered when you want it, where you want it, anytime, anywhere, pretty much. So, high explosive, very nice shell. It gets used a lot. Now we have the Grav Compensator, and this is a weird thing, and the description is not very helpful. So, the Grav Compensator, let's fix this quickly. The Grav Compensator, or Gravity Compensator, adds a downforce where possible to simulate the gravity strength of the aiming/firing altitude at all higher altitudes. This helps maintain accuracy when firing high trajectories. That is a roundabout way of saying you can fire guns in space. So normally, the AI needs to account for bullet drop when firing within the atmosphere, and that gets thrown out the window when you are up in space and there's zero gravity, because you can, by the way, get up into space from the depths. You can get all the way up here. Most of you already know that, but for those of you who don't, you can get all the way up here, and yes, fights can take place up here. It's pretty rad. Where were we? So, the Grav Compensator pretty much is used for that. I have actually never used these. I keep forgetting it exists, but that's its only use. It is to fire guns in space. And that's it. And there's nothing more to say about it, really. Unless I've missed something. Tell me if I've missed something. Moving on, we're now at Flack. Now, Flack is, creates an explosion that is larger in radius but less damaging than standard HE warhead. So, this is the high explosive warhead, more spread out, sillier little brother. So, this is just like you can see. So, high explosive warhead, you have 142 damage, and you have an explosive radius of 4.4 meters. Now, if you have a Flak warhead, the damage is only 59, so it's roughly half, but the radius is 10 meters, and that only goes up until you get to about 500 meters, in which case it's a 25 meter radius and over 1,000 damage. So yeah, less than half of what a high explosive warhead does, but much bigger radius. Which means that weirdly enough, a Flak, in order to maximize damage of the thing, you either need to stack it a lot or you need a quite big shell. So as of right now, 400mm Flak is pretty darn good, because it does reasonable damage, has quite a big rate, 23 meter radius for an explosion is pretty darn big. So this is, this is an ideal shell for both shooting down missiles and shooting down small things that dodge around a lot. So, like in real life, you use Flak mainly for swatting things out of the sky that are small and hard to hit. So, you use high explosive to blow things up, and you use Flak also to blow things up, but different things that you want to blow up. Big things, small things, basically. And by the way, 500mm Flak is surprisingly good, simply because it just needs to hit in the same postcode as the target and it will still do something. So, it's Flak. Now we get onto Smoke, and alas, alackaday, Smoke has seen better days. So, how this works is that this, when a smoke warhead detonates on a target, and by the way, this only works at shells that are 200 millimeters caliber or higher, and it releases a smoke cloud upon shell detonation. So, what that means is, well, exactly what it says. It releases a smoke cloud, and the density of that smoke cloud, or the strength of it, depends on how big the shell is, or how many warheads are on. So if we jump this up to 300, smoke strength 192, now it's 399, and 400, 669, all the way up to 1000, and that reduces the armor penetration of lasers. So, what the? What? Oh, right. It reduces it to blah. So, minimum strength smoke is on an APS shell, reduces laser AP to 51.99%. Okay, that's pretty good. Back in the day, and those of you who've stuck around with me for a while know that I used to love doing this, smoke on APS shells, its main use was to shut down an enemy laser anti-munition system. So you got a laser system going pew pew pew, shooting all your missiles and shells down. You slap smoke on your APS shells, and that just greatly reduces the LAM's power, because it's just choked off and blocked by smoke, and means your missiles and crams and shells can get through. And that was very good and fun. But it's been changed recently, so it just reduces AP, which means it is considerably less good against LAMs now. Which is actually fine, because LAMs is not in a good place at the moment. It kind of sucks at doing, well, anything, really. Crams have too much health, big APS shells have too much health, and missiles also have too much health, so you really need a very big optimized LAMs to do anything. So smoke currently doesn't have much use, unless you want to preemptively reduce the effectiveness of laser weaponry. If you have a little bit of smoke on your warheads, and you just cover an enemy laser-armed craft with it, you are preemptively stopping them from hurting you, which can be quite useful. You just have to make sure the smoke hits the right place. So you're better off, for the most part, really spamming 200mm smoke rather than jamming 500mm smoke. I can't actually remember if the smoke cloud made by bigger shells is physically bigger or whether it's just stronger. Have to test that later. Anyway, that's smoke. Moving on, now we have the Inertial Fuse, and this is a shell that you will probably see used very, very often, but not as often as it used to. And the reason for that I will get into in a second. So, this fuse detonates when a course change is measured. Ricochet, shield disruption or reflection, and water skims can set this off. Useful for enabling shaped warheads, heat or explosive warheads to damage shielded vehicles. These components are delicate and make a shell susceptible to laser damage. I didn't know that. They've added that last bit on. So, if we go here, let's see. So, we have our HE warhead here, 500 meters, and we go here. So, shell health 3,600, inertial fuse. Oh wow, that actually drops the health by quite a bit. Interesting. So the inertial fuse is just basically when the shell changes angle, it explodes. And you can set what the angle tolerance is. So this shell, this hypothetical shell right here, can change direction by less than 10 degrees without exploding. If it changes course by more than 10 degrees all at once, it will explode. And I actually find it's sometimes helpful to set this a wee bit higher than the default, because otherwise it'll explode when it hits water too readily, and that's no good. Sometimes you want to hit a ship's hull below the waterline, and if your inertially fused shells explode too early, they don't do anything. And the reason you're probably not gonna see the shell, this component as much as you used to, is because shields are not in a good way right now. Like, you can get a lot of shells through energy shields without too much difficulty at all, which means that one of the inertial fuse's main functions is not really there anymore. So there's other shells that they explode anyway when they make contact with structural blocks, so you don't need an inertial fuse with them. And yeah, so inertial fuse still has its uses, not as useful as it used to be. The proximity fuse. I have never used this thing because for the longest time there was a bug with it where if it hit a shield it would immediately teleport its payload of whatever shell it was on over to the hull of the vehicle in which it was being pointed at, which was no good. And basically it was taboo to even mention these things for the most part. But now, able to set a proximity range for shield detonation. I should really play with this again. It could be extremely useful. So, prox fuse distance, you can set that all the way up to 100, which is a little bit ridiculous. And this, I'm really kicking myself for not playing around with this more. This works very well with timed frag or timed flak, because it means if it even gets near it, it See, there goes my voice. This video is already longer than I meant it to be. If it gets near a target, it explodes and does horrible things to it. So, need to play with this a bit more. I will let you know, hopefully, when I've been played around with this, and I'll tell you how it is. Anyway, moving on. Emp Warhead. It contains a modest EMP charge, and modest is the word. APS is still one of the not best ways to deliver EMP. So, basically, electromagnetic pulse, electric damage. It travels through metal and alloy, fries AI components, and damages heavy armor, and that's about it. So, EMP is something I really like using because it's quite sneaky, subtle, and it's very useful for disabling and just messing with enemy craft. EMP strength 33 isn't going to do anything. So EMP is a little bit weird. Having lots of flak warheads on separate shells, or HE or frag, is very, very useful because the damage stacks better, and just you have a whole lot of kaboom all at once. EMP doesn't work like that. You are better off having a single larger jolt of EMP, up to 1500 on a 500mm shell, than lots of smaller jolts, because the EMP strength also determines how far it travels. So you want a charge to travel as far as possible. So you even on very big shells, you can't get super good EMP strength. By far, you have better EMP delivery with pretty much every other weapon type, except lasers, which can't do EMP. Durr. So, Cram EMP is very good, Missile EMP is really good, particle cannons deliver very good EMP jolts, if you set them up right. But yeah, APS not so much. They do have their uses though, and I'll probably go into that in a future video, so look forward to that, once my neck recovers from all this talking. And now we get to the stabilizer fin. This is, again, this is another little thing that isn't as useful as it once was. It adds in-flight accuracy at the expense of speed. So, basically it makes the thing more accurate and slower. There's not much to talk about. So, given how accurate advanced cannons are right now, you barely need any accuracy boosters at all, this thing probably isn't going to get much love at all. But it does, yeah, it makes it slower, but really makes things a lot more accurate. So if you are having problems with a very inaccurate shell, and you don't want to add extra barrels or anything like that, this could work pretty well. But yeah, I don't see much use for this as of right now, because APS is very, very accurate at the moment. So enough about that. Now we get to the fuses. Lots of fuses. Well, we've already covered 2 of them, so... altitude fuse. This is a thing that I keep forgetting to play around with. Not because I thought, things change altitude all the time. How do you do this? It turns out, people have told me that this works with timed fuses. So, the setting on here can change depending on what the laser targeter on the APS itself is telling you. For those of you who don't remember, that's this thing that sticks on the firing piece of an APS and gathers time and distance information for target for use for various fuses. So this works with timed fuses, which we'll talk about in a second, and it works with what was I just talking about? Altitude fuses, right? So this is pretty darn good. Well, potentially at the very least, because it means that it only explodes at the altitude that the target is at, which means two things. Firstly, you can shoot at aircraft with this, and you can also potentially shoot at submarines. You can have an anti-submarine gun with this. Because you just shoot at it, and even if your shell falls slightly short, it will explode, like, at the right altitude to deal damage to the submarine. As opposed to the time fuse, which due to water slowdown will probably detonate too early, and the proximity fuse, which probably will miss. Or maybe it will miss. I don't know. But yeah, so altitude fuse, lots of potential there. I have to muck around with that, keep finding new things to science. In any case, then the time fuse, and this I've used a lot. If you want to use a Flack or 180-degree frag with any degree of effectiveness, time fuse is the way to go. So simply, it puts a time on the shell, and that time is, like can be set here. I usually just set it up to full because you pretty much need all the time a laser targeter with this, because that changes the time on the shell and means that it'll set it to correct time to detonate right on top of whatever it's shooting at. So, very useful for anti-air, but also useful for shells that have a massive blast radius. So, we're talking very big, high explosive shells, which happen to have a blast radius that can clip bits off something, even if they explode only near it. So yeah, time fuse, quite helpful for that. Now we get to penetration depth fuse. Now, APS has way less kinetic damage than it used to, so it's not as good at punching, at just brute forcing, piercing an armored target as it used to be, and it's certainly nowhere near as good as, say, a cram shell can do. Cram shells can penetrate ridiculously. Their kinetic damage and their armor piercing is off the charts if you set it up right. But this is what you use if you want to basically pierce through multiple layers of armor and explode on the inside. So, there's two settings on here. Depth distance, so the penetration depth attained before the shell explodes. If the shell runs out of kinetic energy before this depth, it will explode automatically. So, default is 5, good luck piercing through 5 meters of metal, and first surface time. And you need to, you kind of need to customize penetration depth shells to whatever you're planning to shoot at, because there's lots of possibilities. If you set it too high, and you're shooting at a target that's quite small, or has pretty lousy armor, you will overpen consistently, and the shell will detonate on the other side, and it won't be very good. So you want to set the first surface time quite low, just in case that runs into it. If you set it too low, so say you're dealing with something with 4 meter thick armor, and you set it to 2, your shells will stop too soon. And basically, you need to match your kinetic damage and your armor piercing to whatever you're shooting at. So, generally speaking, you want big shells for this. So between, these days, I'd say between 400 to 500 millimeter shells, and preferably with a pretty decent rail boost. Because, like, if you stick enough rail charge into, how much is it? That's 20,000. Let's rail draw 2,000. Let's go here. So yeah, with rail draw, this is only a fuse right now, and it does 22 armor piercing. So yeah, so penetration depth fuse, the short version is you need to design your whole shell around this thing if you're going to use it. So moving on, emergency ejection defuse. Now we're getting into cunning, interesting things. So this is what you stick on a shell when you are using ammo ejectors. So if you have the ammo ejector, which is, where is it? Here it is. So, ammo ejector. This is what you stick on your autoloader, and if the ammo ejector, or the autoloader itself, is destroyed, thank you to the person who reminded me that if the ejector is destroyed, it automatically ejects stuff. It spits the shells out so they don't explode and blow up your whole ship, or craft, rather. This is one of the best things you could use with that, because when the shells are ejected, they still have to go somewhere. And if that place is inside your craft still, they will blow up and the whole ejection thing would be pointless, unless they have this. So this component is linked to the ejecting system attached to the autoloader, and will automatically defuse the shell prior to its ejecting, making it totally harmless. And the warning, big letters, works only when the shells are ejected. I'm not sure how else you will have that. I think what that means is that friendly fire is still a possibility. If the shell is fired, it will still hurt you if you have not set up your failsafes and firing restrictions right, so be aware of that. Well, I was looking at the wrong thing. There it is. Okay, and now, moving on, we get to look at heat a little bit earlier than intended. So, this thing is exactly like the shaped charge head. And what that means is that it uses all high explosive warheads, so the AT Warhead Body behind it, to create a shaped charge. So uses all explosive charges connected behind it to blast a stream of superheated armor piece and component to the target. And the secondary version of this allows dual warhead heat shells for penetration of ERA armor. That is not correct. ERA stops it. A secondary warhead is only 80% as powerful as a primary one with the same number of HE modules. So, this allows you to stick a shaped charge component in the middle of your shell as opposed to right on the front of your shell. So it means, say, you could stick a Frag Head or Emp Head or a Composite Head, Skimmer Tip, all these other nose things on the front of your shell, and you can have this in the middle, which means you can do wacky things like having you can have a penetration depth heat, which is a bit of a meme shell for the wild, apparently. That doesn't work very well, by the way, or at least I've never tried it. It might work very well, but I'm told it doesn't, so probably not. So speaking of what goes on the front of your shell, we finally get to the heads, the noses. And a lot of these we can skim over because they're pretty much front versions of shells that components that were in the middle. So HE head is exactly like the HE warhead body, except it goes on the front. It's more aerodynamic. It's more aerodynamica. Spelling thing that needs to be fixed. Devs, if you're watching this, that creates an explosion detonation. It functions exactly the same, and it even has the exact same stats. The only difference is it's more aerodynamic. So 375 meters per second with 2,000 railgun charge. Now it's 289. So we go here, and more kinetic damage as well. So this is what goes on the front of your shell if you want lots of boom boom. Now over here is the disruptor conduit. This is interesting. This does not work the same way it used to. Back in the day, especially when these things were first introduced, how it works. Let's ignore that for now. You stick this on the front of your shell with EMP warheads behind it. It's like shaped charge but anti-shield. It hits the shield, it automatically detonates, and it damages whatever shield is projecting. Well, it damages the shield projector directly upon making contact with the shield. That is not how it works anymore. It's like, this is now the ghost shell. So, the disruptor conduit scrambles shields it passes through, reducing their effective strength. This effect scales with the EMP charge of the shell. Delicate electronics take up a lot of space, reducing strength of all payloads to 50%. Again, this does not work with Frag last time I checked, so EMP strength reduced to 25% current value. So, this one little conduit, this also acts as a little EMP head, by the way. Is it actually stronger than EMP head? Nope, it is not. That's good. That'd be very silly. So, this is quite a fast shell, by the way. They used to be one of the slowest shells you could get. Now they're one of the fastest. That's interesting, but makes sense, because you look at that, it's very pointy. So yeah, this ignores shields completely, basically, and weakens them as it passes through. It would be broken if it wasn't for the fact that shields are pretty useless and pretty much entirely optional right now. So these are not a necessary shell. They're just, you use them if you want things to whistle straight through shields with zero chance of reflection, and then deliver a little bit of EMP on the end just to add insult to injury. So yeah, disruptor conduits, they're not as useful as they once were, and at the same time they're more useful than they once were, which is weird, I know. Now we go to the squash head, and oh boy, the squash head is a game changer. So, this is a HESH. This is what HESH is. So, if you don't know what HESH stands for, it stands for High Explosive Squash Head. So, the idea behind this is that you have kind of in real life, the way this is used is for anti-tank duties is it's a wad of explosive that gets squashed against the target, it flattens out, and when it explodes, it sends a shockwave through whatever it's hit, and that shockwave travels through whatever material it is, and when it reaches the other side of whatever layer the material is, be it metal tank armor or a concrete bunker, the shockwave causes little fragments to break off and spray all over the place, which is called spalling, and that is very, very strong in this game. So if we look at the description, significantly lowers AP but concentrates all explosives placed directly behind it into a shockwave that can create interior spalling and destroy large chunks of vehicle walls. This is a very strong component. This is still possibly one of the best armor-breaking components in the game, largely because that shockwave, so the thump damage, and thump damage is a thing unto itself, hits multiple blocks, ignores armor stacking, and damages blocks for 20 AP, so that's pretty strong. And the spalling is the spalling fragments those fragments are basically spawned with twice the armor penetration of whatever block they spawn from. So if we look right here at this heavy armor beam right here, and god, that's really terrible to look at. Okay, so hopefully you can see now. So this heavy armor beam has 40 AC. So if a Hesh shell were to hit that, it would spawn with 80 AC. So it would do full damage to other heavy armor beams, which is very, very powerful. So Hesh is one of the things you need to keep an eye out for, and you need to design your entire ships around, because it basically means the interior layers of your craft should be lined with wood, so that whatever fragments spawn from them have only 6 AP as opposed to, say, 80, which makes a very big difference. And then you have a small catcher behind that, made of metal or athlete blocks or something, which can take whatever damage those fragments would dish out. So, this is very meta head, still. It does not work so well against craft which have spore liner at all. It does almost nothing to them, and it also doesn't do much to very thick armor. So if a squash head hits a layer of armor that's something like 7 meters thick or something like that, the shockwave will not reach all the way through. I forget what thickness you need for that to happen, but it's pretty thick, and it is possible. I also just noticed how weird the word squash looks like in that font. Is that spelt right? It probably is. In any case, so, Frag Head, pretty much exactly the same. It's the nose version of the Frag Warhead Body, makes a little fragment, shrapnel things. And, by the way, 500mm fragmentation, damage per frag is a lot. It is a lot, just so you know. In practice, doesn't do a hell of a lot because it has lousy AP, but what can you do? Also, lower fragmentation number. Okay, then we have Emp Head. It's exactly the same as the Emp Warhead Body, except it's on the nose. And now we get to the Heavy Head. And in days gone by, this was referred to as the AP Capped Head, but to avoid excessive confusion, this is replaced. This is now called the Heavy Head. So, we're getting back into kinetic shields. So, the Heavy Head is like the nose equivalent of the solid warhead body. Of the 3 kinetic heads available to you, which are, by the way, Heavy Head, Composite Head, and Sabo Head. Sabo? Excuse me, I'm still confused. This has the highest kinetic damage, but the lowest armor penetration. So, just to contrast, so we got a... Let's go back to... Let's go to 100mm. So, what we have here, 500. So, we've got a 100mm shell with a heavy head. It does 243 kinetic damage and 31.2 armor penetration. You go to a composite head, and we can talk about all 3 of these at once actually, because they're all very similar but also different. It's also the slowest out of these 3 heads. It is the lowest speed, although it's still pretty darn fast. You go here. It is faster than a lot of other shells, although curiously not faster than a squash head, which is... By the way, is this intentional, devs? For the squash head to actually be faster than a lot of other heads? Because in real life, hash only really works if the shell is kind of slow, because otherwise it sprays explosive all over the place. I don't know, like, someone tell me what the deal is with that, please. Anyway, so getting to the heavy head, 243, 31.2, 163, 61.9, and then 122, 103.2. So, most kinetic damage is the heavy head, and lowest AP. Composite head is the in-between one, so less kinetic damage than the heavy head, less armor piece than the SPO head, but more KD than the SPO head, and more AP than the heavy head, and the SPO head is the fastest of the lot by a long, long way, and most armor PS and least kinetic damage. So these three are the ones you kind of rub your chin and think about when you want a kinetic shell. But there's also this one. So, the Skimmer Tip. I have never used these. So, it's also a kinetic shell of sorts. It has pretty decent armor damage, armor piercing. It has better armor piercing than the heavy head, actually. So what does this do? This shell has a 100% chance to skim back off the water surface and up into the air. Increases the angle of incident for skimming from 50% to 30%. This does not sound useful when you first hear of it, and probably when you first try it for the first 100 times. There is one ship I remember playing with, and unfortunately I'm so sorry to whoever made that craft, that that actually managed to make this useful. It's useful with timed shells if you want to wreck an enemy ship's deck. So, what you do is, you have a skimmer tip on the front of a shell that has timed frag, or timed flak, or even timed high explosive, or something like that. And what that means is, when you're firing at something that is on water, and keep in mind, there's no penalty to using this. It doesn't really reduce armor penetration, it doesn't reduce payload or anything like that, so it's basically, it's like a composite head but with less AP, basically. It bounces off the water and then it explodes right above the enemy craft, which means it sends flak or frags or whatever straight down onto the deck and just wrecks little secondary guns, the AA guns, whatnot, and it's a bad time for the enemy ship, but a good time for you. So, potential use right there. Apart from that, I have no idea. Also, this video is more than an hour long. I'm so glad I decided to split this up. So, next, Flak Head. Same thing as the Flak Warhead Body. Moving on. And what the hell were we at? I just talked up. Why is the Skimmer Tip here twice? Flak Head. What? Hang on. Whoa, 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 whoa. Why is the Skimmer Tip here twice? Am I crazy? Am I a crazy person? Hang on, Emp Head. Emp Head, did I miss something? Oh no, Stabilizer Fin Body. There we go. Why did I change that? That's weird. Skimmer Tip. Flak Head, same as before. SPO Head, we've already talked about that. That is the armor penetrating little brother of the heavy head and composite head. We've already talked about that. Shape Charge Head. This is the other meta shell. This, I have found, is the one shell component, well, the one warhead, I should say, which is useful at every single gauge, as of right now. It is useful at 18mm if you spam it. It is useful at 500mm if you spam it slightly less. This is possibly one of the strongest shell components in the game, and shells that use it are among the strongest in the game, because it doesn't care about armor, it goes straight through it. So, no AP, uses all immediately connected explosive charges to blast a stream of superheated armor-piercing copper into a target. So, we've already talked about that a little bit, with the Shape Charge secondary. But yeah, this is the big daddy. This is the one where the magic really happens. So, how this works is you've got the penetration factor, so the heat penetration metric is this number, so in this case 14.2, divided by the square root of the armor value. So, the square root of 40, I think, is 8. Correct me if I'm wrong. So this shell already, and this is just one Shape Charge Head, can go through one layer of heavy armor. If you ramp that up to 20, So this 500mm shell, wrap that up to 20, it can go through 2 layers of armor. Actually, it can go through 16... It can go through 2 layers of heavy armor, and then I think 15... I think the square root of 15 is 3. Please correct me if I'm wrong on that. It can go through many, many layers of metal, and can deliver some pretty nasty fragmentation on the way. So, upping the penetration metric reduces the damage of those fragments. So you see, minimum penetration factor 564, maximum 443. Not a huge difference because that still really, really hurts. So yeah, that is... Heat is one of the strongest shells in the game, and incidentally, if you stick an inertial fuse on this, this triggers when it hits shields, and that copper stream will reach the target and do its thing. So, it is an anti-shield shell, it is an anti-armor shell, it is an anti-compact design shell. The only thing that really stops it is spaced armor. So, what that means is, for those of you who don't know, is you have multiple layers of armor. Say this is layer 1 and layer 2, and say we have something delicate and delicious over here. If a heat shell hits here, that heat stream will go straight through both these layers, spray out fragments, and boop, kill that. If you arrange armor like this, so we put an air gap there, and here's our squishy deliciousness, what happens is heat shell comes in, yeah, boop, detonates, penetrates, frags are spawned here, and it's stopped at this layer. Because they spawn in air gaps. They always spawn in air gaps. They used to be able to jump air gaps. They can't do that anymore, thankfully. And the squishy deliciousness is saved. Which is like AI, ammo, engines, stuff like that. So, that's another thing to like keep in mind when designing your ships, is that with Hesh, you basically need armor like this if you want to survive heat and Hesh ruining your life. Replace the heavy armor with metal. Squishy deliciousness is right here. Hesh shell hits here, boom, and the shockwave goes through here. Spall is created because it comes off wood. It has lousy armor penetration, is stopped by the spall catcher. Heat shell comes in here, boom, penetrates through this. Fragment spawn is stopped by the spall catcher. Squishy deliciousness is saved. This is one of the longest videos I've ever made. I did not expect that. So, shaped charge head, something to watch out for. This is a very, very strong shell. Component, be aware of that. So, lastly we have the hollow point head, which is one of my favorites. And the hollow point head is the... I guess there's 5 kinetic heads, if you count heavy head, composite head, skimmer tip, and bow head, and hollow point. So, what this thing does is that it flattens on first impact, imparts all kinetic energy into the surface with an armor-piercing value of 10. That's a lie, that's been updated. Useful for taking out small and armored targets. That is also a lie. It is great against a lot of things if you set it up right. This is not as strong as it once was, because kinetic damage as a whole has been reduced by a lot. It's still useful. In particular, it flattens on first impact. This is the thing that makes inertial fuses considerably less useful. I should also mention as well, squash heads and shaped charge heads, they don't need inertial fuse. Well, they don't strictly need them, because when they never bounce off armor. If they make contact, they explode. That's it. Same thing with hollow points. When they make contact, they flatten out and they deliver whatever payload they have. So, if they actually work quite well with EMP, because if you have an EMP shell and you don't want to use disruptive conduits, you can stick a hollow point on the front, and even if it does terrible kinetic damage, it basically acts like an effective inertial fuse. If you have an inertial fuse on it, it might trigger against a shield, and that's no good anyway. So, yeah, hollow point EMP is one of my favorite shells. It's not fantastic, but it's one of my favorites. And if you add a bit of rail draw to this thing, that number starts getting a lot bigger, and a lot more satisfying. So, we go here. Oh, suddenly it's 4,000 armor piercing of 16. And this is just one component, by the way. They can get a lot bigger than this. In fact, you have a big shell with a hollow point on the front, it still can do noticeable damage. Probably not on its own, but that thump damage adds up. So remember, thump damage passes through multiple blocks, ignores armor stacking. That adds up very quickly. So yeah, that's every shell component that is currently in-game. This video was much longer. than I originally thought it was going to be, so I'll have to end it here. And my voice is dead. So, hope you enjoyed that, hope you learned something, hope you... I just hope for things in general, I guess. Why is the AC count constantly going... What? That was weird. Anyway, let's get off that tool. So, thank you all so much for watching. Please like, comment, subscribe. If you want to see more videos like this, support me on Patreon if you like, it really helps. Thank you to my current Patreon supporters. And sorry there wasn't more action in this video. I didn't know it would be this long. Hopefully the next video, well, definitely the next video, there'll be a lot more stuff blowing up. So, farewell!